Part 4, Chapter 2, The Last Fight of Achilles. Bright Dawn, daughter of the mists of night, flung wide the gates of heaven for the chariot of the sun. Her rosy light shone palely on this gray morning, on which her son, Memnon, lord of Ethiopia, was going out to war. Long ago, when King Priam was still a youth, his brother, Tithonus, had been loved by the dawn goddess, who carried him away to dwell with her in her many-colored house forever. Memnon, their child, now ruled over all the dark peoples of the distant east, at the edge of the world itself. So far was his kingdom from Troy that only in the 10th year could he bring help to his uncle. Now at last he had arrived with a mighty army to hearten the discouraged Trojans with the thought that they too had a hero who was goddess-born. Far under the sullen sea, Thetis sat silent in the midst of her maidens. The wisdom that was hers from her father made her aware of death standing over Achilles, and she dreaded the gigantic son of the goddess of dawn. Dust swirled over the plain of Troy as the dark hosts of Ethiopia rushed out like a whirlwind into the fight. The sound of their wild yells ran echoing over the ridges of Ida, while the distant halls of Olympus heard the crash as rank met rank. Swarthy Memnon was a giant matched only by Ajax, but rivaling Achilles in furious speed. The great spear he wielded was so huge that its point alone was half the length of a man, yet Memnon swung it in one hand as though it had been a reed. He fell upon Nestor's men, who stood in his path like a lion on a flock of sheep. Men dropped to right and left of the warrior till he walked over their corpses, and the parched earth was wet with blood. Young Antilochus, furious at the overthrow of his followers, stepped boldly out into the path of the giant to throw his spear. Memnon did not wait to receive the weapon on his shield, but leaped forward 2 men's length at a single bound, stabbing as he came. He landed with such dreadful force that his spear pierced shield and breastplate and stood a hand's breadth out behind the young man's back. Antilochus fell dead without a cry. Old Nestor, maddened to desperation by the loss of his eldest and most beloved son, snatched the whip from his charioteer to lash his horses into the fray. "Keep back, old fool!" shouted Memnon. "It is not for you to fight with such as I." The old man leaned forward in his chariot and cast his spear with a quivering hand. Memnon laughed as it fell far short, and he turned aside into the press of the battle. Nestor wavered for a moment, near to tears for his dead child and for his own feebleness. "Let Achilles avenge my son," he said at last, turning away, "for he has always loved him well." Now the pale goddess of dawn sighed heavily, and the little winds that attended her chariot shivered with fear. Thetis covered her face, lest her straining eyes behold the death of her son. Rank on rank, the immortal gods looked down from their thrones of cloud as the sons of 2 goddesses met like twin thunderbolts upon the plain of Troy. The swords of the champions flashed like lightning as they rained down blows more swiftly than the eye could follow them. Twice they closed shield to shield, and their tossing crests of horsehair mingled as they wrestled, each stabbing for the other's throat. Achilles seized from the earth a deep-rooted boundary stone that had marked the limit of the plowland in far-off, happier times. No other Greek but Ajax could have lifted such a weight and hurled it on his opponent like a stone sped from a sling. The immortal temper of Memnon's shield withstood the impact, and behind it the great giant stood immovable. For a moment, Achilles too paused in wonder. Then, with a roar, the champions leaped together once more, and fire flew from their smitten helmets. Dust arose and settled on the fighters. Sweat caked it on their faces. Dark splashes of blood from the struggle around them flecked their limbs. About them, the battle raged like a storm at sea, while maddened horses trampled on the bodies of the slain. However, there was a clear space about these giants in spite of the press, for none dared intervene between the heroes, sprung from the goddess of dawn and the silver-footed nymph of the sea. Wind swept aside the dust of battle, and the immortals high in the air cried aloud with the sound of thunder, for by Memnon stood black fate, and by Achilles a glory like a god. With a mighty thrust, Achilles' sword sped clear through Memnon's body, and the giant fell like a great tree, his armor clanging about him in the dust. Dawn covered her bright face in cloud, while the shining Achilles bent to strip off the armor from the dead. The little winds with soft sighing slid gently down to earth in silver mist, and lifting the corpse of Memnon, bore it away. Achilles shouted with triumph as he leaped on the Ethiopians and scattered them howling before him, sweeping with them the Trojan forces who had trusted in their might. Men threw down their shields in panic or climbed on their chariots and fled, but though they ran with desperation, Achilles, clad in full armor, was swifter far. Soon the gates of Troy were flung open, but so great was the press of fugitives struggling for safety that no man could close them again. A great cry arose from the walls, for in the midst of the mass raced Achilles, and now he stood and slew in the space between the open gates. "Troy is taken!" cried the women from the walls, while the children who stood about them shrieked in panic. And the old men shouted vainly to the helpless guards of the gate. Troy would have been taken indeed, were it not for Phoebus Apollo, who had loved and watched over the city since its founding long ago. Swift as a ray of sunlight, Apollo left his seat in the clouds and stood in the courtyard by Paris in the likeness of a young man. "Will you not shoot for Troy's sake?" said he, giving him an arrow. Paris stood on the steps of a palace far out of the throng, for he had been among the first to turn tail. He fitted the arrow to his bow with trembling hands and shot over the heads of his people at the gleaming figure in the gate. The arrow was hastily aimed, and its force was soon spent. It dropped at the feet of Achilles, and would have plunged harmlessly into the earth, had not the hero turned suddenly to ward off a blow aimed at his back. As he did so, the arrow of the coward pierced him in the heel, where Thetis had held him long ago when she dipped his body into the Styx. Achilles staggered for a moment as the fiery poison of the god burned through his veins. Elsewhere in his body, the magic of the Styx would have protected him from the venom, if not from the wound. He recovered, made no more thrust at an enemy, then dropped his sword and collapsed in the dust. With a great shout of triumph, the Trojans rallied, while the Greeks rushed forward to rescue the body of the hero from between the enemy's gates. Once again, these were jammed open as men struggled to turn and rush back into the battle. Soon the space between them was trampled and dark with blood. The body of Achilles lay beneath the feet of the fighters, face down upon the earth. Part 4, Chapter 3. The Armor of Achilles. A terrible wailing surged out of the depths of the sea as though the waves were washing the sound up against the coasts of Troy. Out in the bay by the waters rolled apart, revealing a company of women in the midst of whom rode Thetis on the crest of a wave that broke into foam about her silvery feet. Little ripples of light danced around her and shimmered on the water over which she passed. So fair was she, in spite of her sorrow, that the men on the beach stared at her in awe as she flung herself down by the bier on which they had placed her son. Thetis lifted the bright head of Achilles and pillowed it upon her arm. "My son, my darling, why were you born to this end?" lamented she. "Why did Zeus force me to marry a mortal and bear him a child, though I am the daughter of the ancient sea? Even in his boyhood I had no joy in my son, because he could not live with me in the green caves of my father. When he became the greatest of heroes and my pride, I could not even comfort his grief. Now he, who has conquered Dawn's son, lies slain by a coward. Alas for Dawn, she too knows what it is for an immortal to be the mother of a man who must die." The goddess fell on the body of her son and kissed it, while her nymphs took up a dirge. The Greeks stood by in silence, awe-stricken by the sight of gods and the lovely sound of their song. The sun went down and the moon came up, but all night long men were bewitched by the music of the immortals, while tears ran down their cheeks for the death of a man who was beautiful and short-lived as the spring. How long they were entranced they did not know, but afterward they seemed to have passed in a dream through many nights and days. At last the dirge was done, and Thetis bade men light the fire to burn Achilles, as Patroclus had been. This they did, and the ashes of the two comrades were laid together. Next, Thetis caused the spoils of Achilles to be brought forth from his hut, and given as prizes for the funeral games in his honor. There was a golden cup that had been the greatest treasure of Andromache's father in Thebe before Achilles took that town. 2 silver bowls had been the price of Lycaon when Achilles sold him in Lemnos over the sea. There were the arms of Hector, of Memnon, and of Troilus, whom Achilles had cut down in the flower of his youth. Cattle came from raids on Mount Ida, and slaves from countless cities, together with many talents of gold. All these things were given as a memorial to the dead hero, but Thetis kept back until the last, the greatest treasure of all. Here lies the armor of Achilles, which the immortal Hephaestus made for him, she said. There is nothing like it upon earth, and it shall be worn by the man whom the Greeks judge the greatest hero, now that my son is dead. I claim this prize as my due, stated Ajax proudly. You all know that I am the strongest fighter left in the host. It was I who defended the ships when Achilles sat in his tent, and the rest of you were wounded or turned tail. For this service alone I have earned the armor, even if I have not proved my valor 1,000 times in the years that I have been at Troy. The merits of Ajax are great, but mine are yet greater, said Odysseus. Ajax turned on him with a haughty stare, but the king continued calmly. I am not as strong as Ajax, but I have been of far more service to the host. My persuasions brought you to Aulis. My advice has guided you in trouble. I was your ambassador to Troy. More than this, I too am a fighter. Not so great as Ajax in the melee, but far more dangerous, because more cunning. It was I who set the ambush by the gates of Troy, and I who went with Diomede by night to kill Rhisus, before he struck a single blow on behalf of his friends. Such tricks are not fighting, cried Ajax furiously. How dare this smooth ambassador and spinner of words claim to rank above me? I shall kill him for this insult. The Greeks looked at one another in consternation. Old Nestor put a hand on Agamemnon's arm and muttered advice in his ear. We cannot choose between 2 such heroes, said Agamemnon, turning to the throng. But Nestor reminds me that we have some judges among us who have no interest but to be fair. Let us call out our Trojan captives and ask them which of the 2 they fear most. There should be no question, said Ajax haughtily. You all know I could break this plausible cheat in 2. Odysseus smiled in silence, while the other chiefs applauded Agamemnon's words with great relief, for they had feared that a terrible quarrel would disrupt the host. The Trojan captives were speedily assembled, and the question put to them. They answered readily. Our men fear Ajax in battle, they said, but the whole city dreads Odysseus like the spirit of death itself. He is the evil genius of Troy. You shall repent the judgment, cried Ajax hotly. I am the greater fighter. As all admit, I will have my right. The award was fairly made, said Agamemnon. Ajax could not trust himself to answer, but turned and stalked off to his hut. Odysseus took the arms of Achilles, rejoicing, though he could not wear them, for Achilles had been far taller than he. Still he laid them in his hut, and was accepted as the greatest hero in the host, while Ajax brooded over revenge. Little Tecmessa, who was Ajax's captive, and whom he had promised to make his wife, sat watching her lord with wide frightened eyes, as he grasped the sword and muttered to himself. Once or twice she ventured a timid question, but got no answer. Teucer, who was always kind to her, had gone on a raid, taking the greater part of Ajax's men. Tecmessa gave her little boy to his nurse, for she was frightened. She lit a lamp and sat down beside her lord, wishing the night was past. To Ajax, brooding over his defeat, it seemed impossible to go home and face his father after such a disgrace. Old Telamon was a hard, ambitious man, whose pride in his son was greater than his love. If Ajax came home without the armor of Achilles, Telamon would regard him as a coward who had not been willing to stand up for his right. The bare thought of this was intolerable to the hero. He started up, sword in hand, and went out into the dark. It was Ajax's purpose to fall upon Odysseus and Agamemnon in their tents and slay them, together with such of their men as came to their help. What happened next he did not care. There would have been great slaughter in the host that night had it not been for Pallas Athena, who watched over Odysseus. She now touched the mind of Ajax with madness, so that his glaring eyes passed by the huts of his enemies and fixed themselves upon the great fenced space in which the cattle and sheep that fed the host were penned. The herdsmen were peacefully sleeping when the huge figure of the madman charged upon them, sword in hand. Those who that awoke in time fled screaming, terrified, out of their wits by the great figure bearing down on them in the moonlight, his shining armor flecked by dark stains of blood. Ajax did not pursue them, but fell upon their helpless sheep, and slew until the pen was heaped with bodies. Seizing upon 2 huge rams, whom he took for Agamemnon and Odysseus, he bound them tightly, slung them over his shoulders, and carried them off in triumph before the servants could return with help. Tecmessa, waiting in Ajax's hut, was appalled to see him return red to the elbows and stained from head to foot with blood. He was muttering to himself and did not see her as he slung the 2 rams down in a corner of the hut. "My lord," she said faintly. Ajax made her no answer. He put his hands to his hips and rocked back and forth in front of the 2 rams, gloating. "Who is the greatest hero now?" said he, bursting into a roar of laughter so loud and meaningless that the frightened girl could not fail to see that he was completely out of his mind. Tecmessa crouched in a corner while Ajax delivered a furious tirade to his captives, abusing them and threatening them with every kind of dreadful death. It was soon plain to her what must have happened, but the knowledge was of no use, for she dared not call for help, lest her mad lord fall on his own servants or run amuck through the host. At last the grey light of morning fell through the open door, and she heard Ajax falter, then stop in the middle of what he was saying. Quickly she looked up. The man was staring at the creatures in front of him as though he could not believe his eyes. "He sees them as they really are," thought she. "In another minute he will realize what he has done." Ajax staggered away and sat down with his head in his hands, uttering a deep, long groan, the first that Tecmessa had ever heard from him. The girl crept to the door and went out to get help from the servants, for she saw that Ajax was beside himself with shame and rage, and feared lest he do himself injury. She knew well that his proud spirit would never endure the mockery that this night's work would bring on him. Outside the camp was in an uproar. Ajax had been recognized in the moonlight by one of the herdsmen, who had now told his tale. Wild stories were going around the camp that Ajax was dangerous and must be put out of the way like a mad dog. Taucer, coming back with his men from the raid, was mobbed by a crowd shouting that he was brother to a madman who had attempted to murder the leaders of the host. Agamemnon was summoning an armed guard to surround Ajax in his hut. Quickly, Tecmessa hastened to Taucer and told him all that she knew. "You must come immediately," gasped she, "or he will kill himself. I know he cannot endure the shame of such a deed." Taucer ran for the hut with Tecmessa at his elbow and his men crowding behind. He motioned to them to stand back while he pulled aside the curtain and went in. After a second, he reappeared at the entrance. "Ajax has gone," said he. "Scatter and look for him," implored Tecmessa. "Down by the seashore," added Taucer. "He would not go among the tents." Tecmessa was already halfway to the shore, running wildly. They saw her climb one of the sand dunes and fling herself down on the other side of it with a desolate cry. They found her lying across the body of Ajax, which lay stretched in the hollow with a sword in its heart. "How could you leave me, my lord?" sobbed Tecmessa. "I was your wife, and my boy is your heir. Now that you are dead, your proud father will never own me because I have been a slave. I shall be only a servant to him, and your boy will be brought up in slavery with his mother." "I will look after you, Tecmessa," said Taucer kindly, laying his hand on her shoulder. "I too was the son of a captive, though my mother was by birth a princess. I know what your fate has been, and I will acknowledge your boy as my brother's heir. To my father I am but a useful servant for Ajax. Perhaps he will not even receive me if I go back home and tell him I am alive. But my brother is dead. If that be so, many will follow me into exile, for Ajax's men love me. Then you and your son shall be with us, and somewhere we will make a new home." He lifted the girl gently from the body and guided her home. With his men took up the great hero and followed slowly. Ajax has raised his hand against his overlord, with whom he had sworn to keep faith, said King Agamemnon indignantly when he heard all the tale. "Such a man is accursed and deserves to not be buried at all, but to wander desolate forever on the mud banks of the Styx, cast out from the heaven and earth." "I beat Ajax fairly," said Odysseus, "and he attempted my life in return. However, death pays off all scores. He was a great hero, and we shall not see another fighter like him on earth again."